In a secluded mountain village, every winter brings a bizarre and chilling tradition. The Silent Feast, a night when the villagers gather in complete silence to offer food to an unseen force that roams the forest. They say it's the only way to keep the village safe from them. The creatures that hunt the unwary in the snow. When an outsider named Clara finds herself stranded in the village during the feast, she breaks the silence and accidentally draws the attention of the ancient force that the villagers have been trying to appease for centuries. Now Clara must unravel the mystery of the Silent Feast and find a way to survive the long, frozen night. The storm had been raging for hours, a swirling wall of white that made it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. Clara squinted through the windshield, her gloved hands gripping the wheel tightly as the tires skidded over the icy pavement. She was supposed to be in the city by now, her cozy apartment waiting with warm blankets and hot cocoa. Instead, she was somewhere in the middle of the mountains, hopelessly lost and completely alone. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, and the radio played nothing but static. The only sound was the relentless howling of the wind, a constant reminder of how far she was from civilization. "Great job, Clara," she muttered to herself. "Take the scenic route, you said? Avoid the highways, you said? Perfect idea." The headlights barely pierced the snow, but then she saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance. A house? A town? Whatever it was her only hope of finding shelter before the storm completely buried her. The village came into view slowly, like a ghost emerging from the snow. It was small, just a handful of cottages clustered around a central square. The buildings were old, their wooden frames weathered by years of harsh winters. Clara parked her car on the outskirts and stepped out into the biting wind. The cold was immediate and brutal, cutting through her coat like it wasn't even there. She pulled her scarf tighter around her face and trudged toward the nearest building. A sign hung above the door, its paint faded but still legible. Hearthwood Inn. The door creaked open as Clara stepped inside, and a wave of warmth hit her, carrying with it the faint smell of wood smoke and something sweet, perhaps honey. An older woman stood behind the counter, her expression sharp and cautious. She was dressed in thick layers, her gray hair tied back in a loose braid. "You're lucky to have made it here," the woman said, her voice low. "The storm's only getting worse." "I got lost," Clara said, brushing snow from her coat. "I'm trying to get back to the city, but I couldn't see the road anymore. Can I stay here for the night?" The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the window. "You can stay," she said finally, "but you'll need to follow the rules." Clara frowned. "Rules?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she handed Clara a thick blanket and motioned toward the small sitting area by the fire. "Warm yourself up. I'll explain." As Clara sat by the fire, the woman pulled a chair close and leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight is the Silent Feast," she said. "It happens every winter, on the coldest night of the year. The villagers gather in the square to leave offerings for the ones who come from the forest." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Offerings? Like food?" The woman nodded. "Food, trinkets, anything of value. It's the only way to keep them away." "Them?" Clara asked, her unease growing. The woman's gaze darkened. "The ones who live in the snow. They don't have names, but they're always watching, always waiting. If they hear you, if they notice you, they'll take you." Clara let out a nervous laugh. "You're joking, right?" The woman's expression didn't change. "No one speaks during the feast. No one makes a sound. It's the only way to survive the night." Later that evening, Clara stood at her window, watching as the villagers began to gather in the square. They moved in complete silence, their faces pale and somber. Each carried something, a basket of bread, a carved wooden figure, even a necklace glinting in the dim light. They placed their offerings on a long wooden table set up in the center of the square. The table was covered in a white cloth that fluttered faintly in the wind, and beside it stood a tall, unlit lantern. Clara felt a chill crawl down her spine as she watched. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the villagers moved, their silence more oppressive than the howling wind outside. A soft knock at her door startled her. She turned to see the innkeeper standing in the doorway, her expression grim. "If you stay inside, you'll be safe," the woman said. "But whatever you do, don't make a sound." Clara nodded, her stomach twisting with unease. The innkeeper left, and Clara locked the door behind her. She tried to tell herself it was all just superstition, a strange local tradition that meant nothing. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The hours dragged on, the silence outside growing heavier with each passing minute. Clara sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames, trying to ignore the unease that coiled in her chest. Then she heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, drifting through the cracks in the walls. It was a whisper, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Come." Clara froze, her heart pounding. She held her breath, straining to listen. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Come to the feast." Clara stood, her legs shaky, and moved toward the window. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the curtain before pulling it back just enough to peer outside. The square was empty now, the villagers gone. The lantern beside the table was lit, its flame casting long, flickering shadows across the snow. And then she saw them. Figures moved at the edge of the forest, their forms barely visible through the swirling snow. They were tall and thin, their movements unnaturally smooth. Their faces... Clara couldn't describe their faces. Every time she tried to focus on them, her vision blurred, her mind recoiling. They moved closer to the table, their long fingers reaching for the offerings. Clara's breath caught in her throat. One of them turned, and it looked directly at her. Clara stumbled back from the window, her pulse pounding in her ears. The figure's gaze, or what she imagined was its gaze, had locked onto her, and for a fleeting moment, she felt as though the icy wind outside had swept into her very chest. She shut the curtains quickly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was warm, but her skin felt cold and clammy, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of the table for support. "It didn't see me," she whispered to herself, trying to believe it. "It couldn't have seen me." But she knew better. The whispering returned, louder now, a faint chorus of voices slipping through the cracks in the walls. "Come." Clara pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her head, coiling through her thoughts like smoke. "Come to the feast." A loud thump shattered the silence, and Clara nearly screamed. Her heart leapt into her throat as she spun around, her eyes darting toward the door. The sound came again, a heavy knock, deliberate and slow. Clara froze, her blood running cold. Another knock. She stepped back, her hand fumbling for the lock. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a soft, familiar voice broke it. "Clara, it's me." Her chest tightened. "Jamie?" Her younger brother's voice drifted through the door, faint but unmistakable. "I need your help. Please, let me in." Clara's mind raced. She'd spoken to Jamie just hours ago, on the phone, from miles away. He wasn't here. He couldn't be here. But the voice sounded so real, so desperate. "Please," Jamie said again. "It's so cold out here." Her fingers hovered over the lock, trembling. "How do I know it's really you?" There was a pause. Then the voice replied, "Don't be ridiculous, Clara." "Who else would it be?" It sounded like Jamie. It even had his familiar tone of exasperation. But something was wrong. The voice didn't feel right. Clara backed away from the door, her breath fogging the air despite the warmth of the room. "You're not him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The knocking returned, harder this time. The door rattled in its frame, the sound echoing through the room. "Let me in," the voice demanded, no longer soft or familiar. It was deeper now, colder, laced with something inhuman. Clara stumbled back, tripping over the rug and falling to the floor. The whispers in her head grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. "Come, come, come!" The knocking stopped abruptly, and then the handle began to turn. Clara scrambled to her feet, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The door creaked open just an inch, and a blast of icy wind tore through the room, extinguishing the fire in the hearth. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy iron poker, and held it in front of her like a weapon. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice shaking. The door opened wider, and the whispers stopped all at once. The silence was deafening. Clara's grip tightened on the poker as a figure stepped into the doorway. It wasn't Jamie. The thing that stood before her was tall and impossibly thin, its body wrapped in tattered, frost-covered cloth. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a pale, featureless mask, smooth and unnervingly blank. Clara's breath hitched. The temperature in the room plummeted, frost spreading across the floor in delicate, crystalline patterns. The figure tilted its head as if studying her. Then, slowly, it raised one long, bony finger and pointed toward the window. Clara's eyes flicked to the curtains. They fluttered faintly in the wind, the only movement in the still, frozen room. The figure stepped closer. Clara didn't think. She swung the poker with all her strength, the iron connecting with the figure's arm. It let out a hollow, echoing sound, not quite a scream, but something that made her stomach churn. The figure recoiled, its movements jerky and unnatural. Clara took the chance to dart past it, running into the hallway. The inn was eerily quiet. The warmth from the fire downstairs was gone, replaced by an oppressive cold that seemed to seep into her bones. She could hear the faint crunch of snow under her boots, but she wasn't outside. The floor beneath her feet had turned to frost. She ran toward the stairs, but the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. They seemed to echo from every direction, twisting her sense of distance and space. "Come to the feast!" Clara clutched her head, her vision blurring as the whispers pressed against her mind. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall. When she looked up, she was no longer in the inn. She stood in the village square, though she didn't remember leaving the building. The snow was falling heavily, and the lantern by the table burned with an unnatural blue flame. The table was no longer empty. Plates and bowls sat in neat rows, filled with steaming food that hadn't been there before. Bread, roasted meats, fruits, and pastries, all untouched and pristine, as if freshly prepared. And surrounding the table were the figures. They stood perfectly still, their featureless faces turned toward her. The snow didn't seem to touch them, their forms shrouded in a faint, otherworldly glow. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as she realized the villagers were nowhere to be seen. The whispers grew louder, 1,000 voices blending into one. "Join the feast!" The figures began to move, their motions slow and deliberate. They stepped closer to the table, their heads tilting in unison as they gestured toward the empty chair at its center. Clara's legs felt like they were made of stone, her body rooted to the spot. "Join the feast," the voices repeated, more insistent now. One of the figures extended a hand, its long skeletal fingers reaching toward her. Clara stumbled back, her heart racing. "I don't belong here," she shouted. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the air grew deathly still. The figure nearest to her leaned forward, its blank face just inches from hers. "You do now." Clara's breath caught as the figure's blank face loomed close, its cold presence freezing the air around her. The whispers had gone silent, replaced by a deafening stillness that pressed against her ears. The other figures stood motionless by the table, their forms barely visible through the swirling snow. "You do now?" the figure repeated, its hollow voice vibrating through Clara's chest. Clara's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Her feet were rooted in the frost-covered ground, and no matter how hard she struggled, she couldn't break free. The figure extended its hand, its long, skeletal fingers reaching toward her. "Join us," it said, its tone an icy command. "No!" Clara shouted, summoning every ounce of strength she had. The moment the word left her lips, the world seemed to tremble. The lantern's blue flame flickered wildly, and the figures froze, their heads snapping toward her in unison. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than before. "She speaks." "She resists. She does not belong." Clara felt the ground beneath her begin to crack, jagged lines spreading outward like a spider web. A bitter wind howled through the square, and the snow whipped into a blinding frenzy. Her feet suddenly came free, and she stumbled backward, falling hard onto the icy ground. The figure closest to her recoiled, its movements sharp and unnatural, as though it were being pulled away by some unseen force. But the others began to move. The figures advanced slowly, their featureless faces fixed on Clara. The whispers grew louder, each word cutting through the air like shards of ice. "Join the feast. Take her." She must not leave. Clara scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she turned and ran. The snow clung to her boots, each step feeling heavier than the last. The village square seemed endless now, the cottages nothing more than dark, distant shapes lost in the storm. She glanced over her shoulder and saw them following, their movements eerily smooth and fluid despite their skeletal forms. They didn't run. They didn't need to. They were closing the distance with an unnatural ease, gliding over the snow like shadows. Clara ducked into an alley between two cottages, her chest heaving as she pressed herself against the wall. The whispers faded slightly, but the cold remained, a biting presence that gnawed at her bones. She needed to think, to hide. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything that might help. A pile of firewood lay nearby, partially covered by snow. She grabbed a thick log, the rough bark biting into her hands, and held it tightly. The figures appeared at the mouth of the alley, their featureless faces turned toward her. "You cannot run," one of them said, its voice low and hollow. Clara raised the log, her hands trembling. "Stay back." The figures didn't stop. Desperation surged through Clara as she swung the log with all her strength. It struck the nearest figure, shattering its frost-covered frame into a cloud of icy fragments. For a moment, Clara felt a flicker of hope, but then the fragments began to reform, swirling together in the air until the figure stood whole once more. Her stomach dropped. The figures moved closer, their cold, skeletal hands reaching out. Clara turned and ran, the whispers clawing at her mind. She burst into the inn, slamming the door shut behind her and throwing the latch. The warmth of the room was gone, replaced by the same biting chill that permeated the square. "Marta!" Clara shouted, her voice echoing in the empty space. There was no answer. She moved through the inn, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The fire in the hearth was out, and frost coated the walls, the furniture, even the windows. It was as if the cold had consumed everything. "Marta?" she called again, her voice trembling. Still nothing. A faint sound drew her attention, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the far end of the hallway. Clara hesitated, her pulse quickening as she stepped closer. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from behind a door at the end of the hall. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. Slowly, she turned it and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from the frost-covered window. Marta sat in the corner, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on something Clara couldn't see. "Marta?" Clara whispered, stepping closer. The innkeeper didn't respond. Clara knelt beside her, shaking her shoulder gently. "Marta, it's me. What's going on? What are those things?" Marta's lips moved, but her voice was barely audible. Clara leaned closer, straining to hear. "Don't let them take you," Marta whispered. Her breath froze in the air, and then her body slumped forward. Clara staggered back, her heart racing. "Marta?" The innkeeper didn't move. A loud crash shattered the silence, and Clara spun around. The front door of the inn had been thrown open, and the cold poured in like a living thing. The figures were inside. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears as she ran back down the hallway. She grabbed a chair from the sitting room and shoved it against the door, barricading herself inside. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with their icy chant. "Join the feast! Join the feast!" The frost spread across the walls, creeping toward her like a living thing. The lantern she had grabbed flickered weakly, its flame barely holding against the cold. Clara backed into the corner, clutching the lantern tightly. She didn't know how to fight them, how to escape. All she knew was that the feast wasn't about food, it was about them. And she was their next offering. The frost crept closer, spiraling across the floor like vines made of glass. Clara clutched the lantern, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the cold pressed in around her. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping voices echoing through the room. "Join the feast! Take your place. You belong to us." The figures were on the other side of the door, their silhouettes visible through the frosted glass. Their featureless faces turned toward her, and their skeletal hands scratched softly at the wood as though savoring the inevitable. Clara's mind raced. She couldn't stay here. The frost was consuming the room, and the door wouldn't hold them for long. She had to run. Her eyes darted to the window, its panes thick with frost. It was her only chance. She grabbed the chair she had used to barricade the door and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, icy shards raining down onto the snow outside. The cold hit her like a physical force, but she didn't hesitate. Clara climbed through the broken window, her coat snagging on the jagged edges. She landed hard in the snow, the freezing air stealing the breath from her lungs. Behind her, the door splintered. The figures spilled into the room, their movements unnervingly smooth as they turned toward the shattered window. Clara scrambled to her feet, clutching the lantern as she stumbled toward the forest. The snow was deeper now, swallowing her boots with every step. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but she had no other choice. The village square was behind her, the table and its offerings now obscured by the storm. She could hear them following. The whispers filled the air, louder than ever, twisting through the wind like a song of inevitability. "Come to us. Do not run. You are ours." Clara pushed forward, her legs screaming in protest as the snow pulled at her with every step. The forest offered no safety, but it offered distance, and distance was all she had. The trees swallowed her, their twisted branches reaching overhead like skeletal hands. The whispers faded slightly, replaced by the sound of her own labored breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot. But the cold didn't fade. The frost was spreading here too, crawling up the trunks of the trees, their bark cracking under its weight. The lantern's weak flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her with every step. Ahead, the forest opened into a small clearing. In its center stood a stone altar, ancient and weathered, its surface covered in ice. The sight sent a chill through Clara that had nothing to do with the cold. This was it. She didn't know how she knew, but this was the source of the silent feast. The whispers surged again, louder and more insistent. The figures emerged from the trees, gliding toward her with an unnatural grace. Their blank faces reflected the faint light of the lantern, their forms shrouded in a swirling frost. Clara backed toward the altar, her mind racing. She had no weapons, no plan. All she had was the lantern and a growing sense of defiance. They didn't just want her to die. They wanted her to submit. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. One of the figures stepped forward, its hand outstretched. The others circled the clearing, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators savoring the hunt. Clara raised the lantern, its flame flickering weakly. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice breaking. The figure paused, tilting its head as though studying her. Then it stepped closer. The whispers grew deafening, the words twisting through Clara's mind like icy tendrils. "Offer yourself. Take your place. End the feast." Clara's grip tightened on the lantern. If this was the center of it all, then maybe, just maybe, she could stop it. Her gaze shifted to the altar. The frost covering its surface pulsed faintly, as though alive. She didn't think. She acted. Clara ran toward the altar, the lantern held high. The figures let out a hollow, collective cry, their forms rippling with anger as they surged toward her. She reached the altar and slammed the lantern down onto its surface. The glass shattered, the flame exploding outward in a burst of blinding light. The frost recoiled, the air trembling as the light consumed the clearing. The figures let out a deafening scream, their bodies dissolving into streams of mist that spiraled into the sky. Clara shielded her eyes, the heat from the flame washing over her like a wave. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. When she opened her eyes, the clearing was empty. The frost was gone. The trees stood still and dark, their bark unbroken by ice. The air was cold but no longer biting, and the snow beneath her feet was soft and undisturbed. Clara stood alone by the altar, the shattered remains of the lantern at her feet. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling from exhaustion and the lingering terror of what she had just faced. It was over. When she stumbled back into the village, the dawn was breaking. The cottages stood quiet and untouched, their windows glowing faintly with warm light. The innkeeper, Marta, was standing in the square, her face pale but alive. She rushed to Clara's side, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You survived," Marta said, her voice trembling. "You ended it." Clara nodded weakly, her legs barely holding her upright. "I think so." Marta glanced toward the forest, her expression wary. "The silent feast has been part of this village for generations. I didn't think it could ever be broken." "Neither did I," Clara admitted. As the villagers emerged from their homes, their faces filled with cautious hope, Clara felt a strange sense of relief. The nightmare was over, for now. But deep in the forest, at the heart of the clearing, the altar still stood. And though the frost had faded, its presence lingered, a faint hum that only Clara could hear. The silent feast was over, but the forest never forgets.